deliberative democracy and campus free speech. You know, the Constitution, specifically the First Amendment, protects speech no matter how offensive. Now, despite the seeming clarity of the First Amendment, the question of when speech is protected and how remains an enduring tension in our democracy, especially in higher education. Many of you may have heard of the President's new executive order signed on March 21st called Improving Free Inquiry, Transparency and Accountability at Colleges and Universities. The order seeks to promote free and open debate on college and university campuses by directing the Department of Education, among other agencies, to withhold federal research or educational grants from institutions that fail to promote free inquiry or First Amendment rights. Now, we can debate if this policy will help defend free speech on campus or be a cudgel. But what we cannot debate is the value of free speech in an open society. Restrictions on speech in any quarter amounts to censorship and is in violation of the Constitution. In the case of the Academy, any curtailment of speech deprives our students of their rights to hear ideas that they may not agree with or they agree with, but they have a fundamental right to ponder and decide what they make of those ideas. Free speech is tested when the idea or speaker deeply offends our moral code or openly insults our personhood. Let's be clear. The First Amendment does not protect behavior that bleeds into open harassment or threats, nor does it protect speech that creates a pervasively hostile environment for classes of people. But the tension has been, and I suspect will always be, when does offensive or bigoted speech rise to the level that incites behavior that is harmful to the public order? We are fortunate this afternoon to present a panel that collectively have thought long and hard about free speech and its role in our democracy and in the Academy. First, we have Susan J. Becker, Professor of Law Emerita at Cleveland Marshall College of Law and General Counsel to the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio. Professor Becker's legal career has spanned more than 3 decades, including a 2-year clerkship on the Sixth Circuit Court. She also spent 5 years as a litigation associate with Jones Day and 24 years as law professor at Cleveland Marshall. She retired from that position in June 2014. Her professional engagement and academic scholarship centers on attorney ethics and professionalism and on the myriad forms of discrimination that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals experience. Professor Becker currently serves as in a volunteer capacity as a board member and general counsel for the ACLU of Ohio, an organization which he has been associated with in a variety of roles for over 20 years. Next, we have Professor Emeritus Ronald M. Berkman, President Emeritus of Cleveland State. Dr. Berkman was appointed the 6th President of Cleveland State University, a role he served from 2019 to 2018. His tenure and vision transformed CSU into a nationally recognized urban research university, best exemplified by the pursuit of engaged learning, a philosophy that embodies accessible, innovative, and hands-on higher education. Dr. Berkman is a recognized leader and institution builder, having held various leadership positions at Florida International University, including Provost and Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. He began his impactful career at the City University of New York, CUNY, where he served as Dean of Urban Affairs, Dean of Academic Affairs, and founding Dean of CUNY's first School of Public Affairs, located at Baruch College. Now, if one past president of CSU was not enough, we had to go for two. President Emeritus Michael Schwartz is joining us. Dr. Schwartz served as president of Cleveland State University from 2002 to 2009. Prior to that, Dr. Schwartz served as interim president of Cleveland State University. He came to the university from Kent State University, where he is professor emeritus, president emeritus, and professor emeritus. His academic career began at Wayne State University. He later moved to Indiana University in Bloomington, and then moved to Florida Atlantic University as chair of the Department of Sociology. He has served as dean of the College of Social Sciences at Florida Atlantic before moving to Kent State in 1976. Dr. Schwartz has published in the area of social psychology, specifically in adolescent deviant behavior, and in 2005 he co-authored with Bill Bowen the chief purpose of universities, academic discourse, and the diversity of ideas. Dr. Schwartz is peripatetic. He has served as a trustee of the Northeastern Ohio University's Colleges of Medicine, Central State University. He is a member of the North Central Association of Colleges and Schools. He's also served as on the Association of Governing Boards Commission on Strengthening the Academic Presidency. I think you'll agree we have a stellar panel to discuss this issue. Leading the discussion will be our very own Professor Bill Bowen, who is Professor of Urban Studies and Public Policy in the college. He's also President of the Faculty Senate. Professor Bowen cares deeply about this subject, and I can't think of anyone better to lead this panel. Professor Bowen.
Thank you, sir. Before I do anything or say anything, I want to point out that the Office of Civic Engagement has set up voter registration over there. So anybody hasn't registered to vote, you know where to go. I want to introduce the idea behind this panel with reference to the two books that I wrote with Mike Schwartz. First was the Dean said it, the chief purpose of universities, academic discourse, and the diversity of ideas. And in that book, we talked about ideas and expressing ideas and the role of ideas inside the university and how important they are. And the second book, it's called The End of Academic Freedom, which was a little more concerned with the possibility that our freedoms to express ideas might be curtailed for a number of reasons. The premise of both the books is that the core purpose of universities is to create, preserve, transmit, validate, and find new applications for knowledge. Our hypothesis was that the success of universities to achieve that purpose depends upon whether the students and the faculty members and other members of the university community feel safe to engage in free and open discourse, and discourse of the widest possible range of ideas. And sometimes, as Dean Anglin said, those include repugnant ones, and at times they certainly must include dissenting ones. A university can't be a marketplace of ideas and fulfill its fundamental purpose without some substantial measure of free speech on its campus. That's kind of the idea behind the panel here. So here's how we'll proceed. First, each of our panelists will have 7 to 10 minutes to present their perspectives on the issues that are bundled up in the current national and local campus dialogue on free speech. We'll go in alphabetical order, if that's okay, starting with Professor Becker to Berkman and Schwartz. After that, after all three are finished, I'll ask each of you to comment briefly on any of the others' remarks, if you'd like. Then I'll present a couple of brief descriptions of a couple of situations in which free speech on campus is challenged today. and we'll take it from there. I'll present the first situation or case, let the panelists respond, then I'll present the second, and again, the panelists will respond, and then we can open it up for conversation. Okay, so Professor Becker.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. I'm not only an emerita here, I taught here for 24 years, I'm a very proud graduate of this institution of the law school. So I'm speaking both as an academic who did spend 24 years here teaching law students and loved every minute of it, as well as a civil rights lawyer who's been involved in a lot of debates over free speech over the years as they play out. I'm also here representing the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU has been around almost 100 years now, and its founding is traced back to a very small group of activists who, among other things, were outraged at the way people were being, really it was the full weight of the federal government was coming down on people who were protesting the U.S. involvement in World War I and the use of sedition acts, which have been used since colonial times, to really punish people who spoke out, especially against the government, you know, pure political speech. So the ACLU protects all kinds of civil rights and civil liberties, but freedom of speech has always been toward the top of the list. The thing about the First Amendment, it is absolutely stunning in its breadth. When you look at constitutions of other countries, and you mentioned this before, it covers so many different scenarios, and unfortunately, it didn't come with a guide to explain how we were supposed to use it or interpret it. So we've been, you know, fumbling along trying to figure that out for a couple hundred years. But in relevant part, it says Congress shall make no law, it sounds like an absolute prohibition, abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of people to peaceably assemble. So it constrains only governmental actors. It specifically refers to Congress, of course, but that's also been extended to state governments or municipalities or those kind of things, or institutions like Cleveland State University that are run by state actors, essentially. To me, First Amendment is just our democracy at work. We're going through some rough times right now as a country. I really believe that our hope for survival is going to depend on robust animation of the free speech rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. I believe that with all my heart, not just as a professional, civil rights lawyer, but on a personal level. So our focus today is obviously speaking on college campuses and campus speech. And I want to just spend a minute reflecting on what makes maybe an ideal learning environment. From the time of Socrates and Plato, and to be clear, I wasn't around back then. I've been here a few years, but not that long. But from the time of Socrates and Plato, educators have shared the conviction that education is best achieved not by rote memorization of facts and figures and other people's beliefs or theories. Education occurs in its truest sense when we challenge those ideas that are handed to us, how things should be. And again, it could be a scientific theory, or it could be a political theory, or it could just be something about how we should conduct ourselves. But it's only by engaging in serious and contentious and sometimes painful debate that we really engage in the educational process. And sometimes it leads us to affirm our beliefs, sometimes it leads us to abandon our beliefs or maybe modify them. But that is the heart of education, is re-examining what we think to be true and challenging each other in their beliefs as well. So in this ideal world then that I would love to build, college campuses would provide as many opportunities as possible for not just students, but faculty and staff and administrators and all the members of the general public who are in the area that are touched by the university, and that's a lot of people, not just where you're physically situated, but certainly the influence of this university and many others extends way beyond our boundaries. But all of these constituents of the university would have the opportunity, they would have platforms to discuss and debate the really important issues of the day. And those platforms would be open not just to the people who agree with us and who help affirm our beliefs, but people who really challenge us, people who knock us totally out of our comfort zones. Now, that's an ideal world, and I am not so naive. I've been around the block a couple times. I'm not so naive to suggest that we live in an ideal world. Our world is far from ideal, and we don't live in a world where unfettered free speech is just going to lead to individual enlightenment or this utopian society when all people are equal and respected. That's not going to happen. I mean, to the contrary, we live in a time of fierce political and social and racial and economic and other fractures throughout society and throughout the world. We live in a climate that renders civil discourse and debate really, really difficult and challenging. We also live in a time when individuals and groups that identify based on various characteristics are just constantly bombarded with caustic and indeed hateful messages. Even sometimes those messages are just a message that's made in a private context but picked up on social media, and then they literally explode around the world. And the people who are targeted by those comments, every time those reappear, are just, smacked again and again and again with that kind of hateful rhetoric. And it's very, very damaging. It does inflict harm on the intended targets. And we need to work on that. We need to come up with solutions to deal with that. I don't doubt that for a minute. But what's also extremely troubling from a civil liberties standpoint is that today when we hear speech that's offensive, and I don't know about you, but that happens about 27 times a minute to me, it seems like these days. We find speech that's offensive, the first response of a lot of us, and I have this reaction sometimes too, is I want to shut the speaker down, I want to stop that type of speech, and I want the speaker to be punished. I mean, that's just, I think, a natural human reaction. But I think, even though it might be a natural human reaction, it's the absolutely wrong reaction. So, for example, you've seen this, colleges canceling speakers because they're deemed too controversial, or campuses creating free speech zones to try and kind of control anyone from being offended by that speech, and they're usually out in some remote parking lot where no one would ever see or hear them. Those kind of reactions are really harmful, and I think what they're really based in is that when we hear the debate over free speech, it seems to me based on a lot of false dichotomies. So what I mean by that is what we're told is you can have free speech or you can have an inclusive and diverse campus. You can have free speech or you can have equality. You can have free speech or effective resistance to hate. And we buy into those. But free speech is not the enemy here. It is not the enemy here. And I think whenever we react that way, and the first thing we attack is the free speech, we're really losing a lot of opportunities to effectively confront the hatred or the malice or whatever is fueling those comments and those kind of communications. Free speech, not only should it not be sacrificed to help in the name of reaching these laudable goals like equality and diversity and inclusion and safe and secure campuses and those kind of things. Not only should it not be sacrificed, free speech is what can guarantee and can help us build those goals that we strive for. So in times like these, the key to a viable democracy and a rich educational atmosphere, I believe, is not a situation where we're censoring and curtailing speech. The cure is not less speech, it's more speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, a lot of what Dean Anglin and Professor Becker said, I think are going to resonate throughout the discussion of the panel. I think the first observation is that the issue of free speech is not an issue that is isolated or particularly focused on campus free speech. But we have had, and I'll talk about why I think this is the case, kind of a feeding frenzy in the media and also, of course, at national and state political levels about the campus and the issue of free speech on campus. So it's obviously a national issue, as the dean mentioned. We have a president who has signed an executive order focusing on and obviously creating the assumption that in order to foster free speech on a campus, we need an executive order from the president, obviously feeling that there is a deep issue here. We also have a president who has described the press as the enemy of the people, not once, not twice, but 58 times, okay, since he's become president. And of course, the press plays an instrumental role, an incredibly instrumental role in being a platform for free speech and an outlet for free speech. And I'll talk just a little more about that as well. So why is the campus, or why have we gotten so much attention to the issue of free speech on campus? A couple of hypotheses, all right? Number one, there is this abiding, at least as long as I've been on campus, a belief that campuses are hotbeds of left-wing radicals and left-wing thinking. I always wondered, if we were such hotbeds, why we're doing such a bad job, of producing students who carry that into their communities, into their neighborhoods, into their discourse, and into their politics. But there is that belief, and I think that's a piece, all right, of why we're seeing this focus now in terms of college campuses. And of course, the spotlight has been really on the left's suppression of free speech. Just this week, PEN, which is a civil rights, human rights organization, largely representing writers, editors, the press, etc., put out a 100-page report, which I think, I don't know if other people have seen it, is clearly the most comprehensive look at this issue in relation to free speech on campuses. And they conclude, and I'm obviously paraphrasing here, they conclude that there are issues concerning the ability on campuses for individuals to freely articulate ideas, beliefs, values, etc., but they cut across the political spectrum, all right? It is the climate, all right? It is the intrinsic or the extrinsic forces that are making it more difficult for the academy, as others have said, to really carry out its traditional role as a platform for free speech and free ideas. And we're not going to see, in my estimation, an abatement, of this focus on college campuses, as long as the national political dialogue remains as it is. By the way, it's also a global issue, as the dean mentioned, and that is the hallmark of every authoritarian regime around the world is the suppression of free speech and free thought. As Hannah Arendt said, it is what authoritarians depend on as a fuel for suppression. So it is a global issue. It's become a more complex global issue since the internet, and the genie has got out of the bottle, and the ability to control the old traditional vehicles of communication are much more complex. So also, to me, what distinguishes the university from other institutions in terms of this issue of free speech, and in terms of the tension that free speech generates. And free speech should generate tension. Again, as Professor Becker said, we don't have an environment, in which we will all calmly and professionally debate with Socratic ideals particular issues. They're going to be inflammatory. They're going to be issues that are going to arouse passions, and they're going to particularly arouse passions in universities. So what distinguishes universities, to me, from many other institutions is that it brings together, universities do, under one umbrella, individuals with diverse political and social views, and provides venues for the articulation and propagation of those views. Now, we can't, there are some city clubs and there are some other venues, but we know in America that a lot of us are bowling alone. There are not community structures, not institutions that bring together people from diverse places, from diverse ideas, from diverse backgrounds, right? and provide and hopefully actually encourage individuals to have this dialogue with each other. I heard a speech by Bob Gates. Some of you may know Bob Gates was at one time the president of Texas A&M, and then he was the director of the CIA. I guess those are easy transitions from president of Texas A&M to, and then he was the Secretary of Defense, both in the Bush and the Obama administrations. And he was giving a speech at a national meeting of the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and someone asked him about distance education. And this was a time when distance education was going to be the silver bullet, all right, for solving all of the problems of the academy. And they asked him about distance education and what he thinks about distance education. And he said something that always has resonated with me. And that is, and it comes to what we're talking about today, that we have to preserve the university as an institution in which individuals can sit in the same room, look at each other, have discourse with each other, and learn to master the skills of reasoned debate, consideration, etc. That doesn't happen in front of a computer screen. So that's one of the differences, okay, in terms of this institution. And, you know, one of the reasons why the articulation of these views within this context become more heated and obviously more attention-getting. So, you know, in universities, in terms of political viewpoints, it's like having CNN and Fox being in the same family. So, outside the university, we certainly have an environment, okay, in which political camps, and this again makes the university much more distinct, in which political camps live in increasing isolation from each other. The information they receive is increasingly delivered via social media and the other highly partisan channels of communication, and are forced to coexist in a college campus where you just can't be isolated from other points of view. It's this dynamic that creates the tension, and it's this dynamic that creates, for me, the creative tension that we need to preserve as a university. So I just want to cover one other point, and that is the issue of how students should and come to learn about the First Amendment, about civic responsibility, about civic discourse, okay? So there was an article about 6 months ago by Derek Bok, the former president of Harvard. And he said that it will be impossible for universities, or what he said is that universities are in the midst of a crisis of civic education. He convincingly demonstrated that universities are failing to equip our students with the knowledge and skills needed for informed civic engagement. Skills that would help students, actually skills that are rudimentary and students have to understand the First Amendment and its application and its broader implications. So Bach says, if colleges were truly providing effective civic education, one would also expect that the massive increase in the number of college-educated Americans since World War II would have raised the level of political knowledge among young people, since a huge increase in young people post-World War II are getting a college education. Then he cites a number of studies that demonstrate that young people's understanding today of civic education, of discourse, of politics, is no greater than that of high school graduates in the 1940s. Finally, he says, more troubling still, but I think this is all a piece, more troubling still, according to a recent Brookings study, is that 44% of college students believe that hate speech is not protected by the Fourth Amendment. 51% of college students believe that it is okay to shut down a controversial student. 19% believe that even the exercise of violence to keep such a person from speaking is warranted. So, finally, given the paucity of our students' knowledge about civics, about our political institutions, about the functions of democracy, and given that we as institutions have, in essence, failed to provide that structure for students, and the continued tribalization of information and reality, it's not surprising, but it's frightening that we are not preparing our students to confront the increasingly complex challenges in a democratic society. So I think that it is, again, our responsibility to find mechanisms to help our students understand that the future depends on our ability to confront these challenges.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Professor Becker and President Berkman speak for me. Next.
Not getting off that easy.
I know. I want to bring the discussion a little closer to home for just a little while. They do speak for me, by the way. In about 3 weeks, we will observe the 49th anniversary of one of the most horrific events ever on an American college or university campus. And that will be on May the 4th, when on May the 4th, 1970, 4 students were shot and killed, 9 others wounded by the Ohio National Guard at Kent State University. Well, some will argue, of course, they were rioting, but when in fact they were exercising rights of assembly and free speech. Shot and killed by their government. And by the way, Bob Woodward of Woodward and Bernstein fame will be their speaker for that event, and you can look that up on the Kent State website if you want to go down and hear him. I understand it's going to be quite an event. In any case, with that phenomenon squarely in front of us every year, those of us who had served at Kent State, this whole notion of the First Amendment was never lost. It was different from the other campuses on which I had served, at Wayne State, at Indiana University, at Florida Atlantic University, because on more than just that one day at that university, there is a certain intentionality about speech issues, about assembly issues, about concerns of the whole First Amendment, and press issues, of course, in that big journalism school. What is lost, however, is with the videos and the decent books that have been written about this, that there have been responses away from the campuses to issues of free speech that people don't remember, don't know about at all, that tell you something about prevailing attitudes. I'll tell you about one. It was decided early in the 1980s at Kent State by the then president that some physical memorial should be built there to represent what had happened before it was paved over or the place was, it was too late. Without going into all of the details of how long that took, there was a memorial dedicated on May 4th, 1990, to those events. You can go down and see it. And inscribed on that memorial are the words, inquire, learn, reflect, which is kind of the business we're in, as I recall. Just before that memorial was built, by the way, all of it with private money, just before that memorial was built, a member of the state legislature inserted into the budget language words that essentially said, not essentially said, no funds provided in this bill may be used to build a memorial at Kent State University. And what did the memorial say? Inquire, learn, reflect. So the political effort to squelch free speech was set before those of us who were reading bills in those days, which, by the way, is a tiny minority of humanity. But it was not isolated. And you might remember that in North Carolina, in about that same era, legislation was brought before their legislature that is now known as the University of North Carolina speaker ban. And Senator Jesse Helms got that initiated in the state to ban all of these commie speakers that were going to come. This is a little bit of public oppression of free speech, but it was there to see. And by the way, there were some heroes in this. William Friday, who was the president of the University of North Carolina, vociferously fought this in the General Assembly, in their General Assembly, and he won it with, by the way, the help of a young journalist whose name was David B. Cooper, who later became the editorial page editor of the Akron Beacon Journal here. There are those kinds of external forces that come to play in the suppression of ideas. We call it speech, right? That's the way we say them, but this is the suppression of ideas. Sometimes, in the course of the suppression of ideas, as Pogo said, we have met the enemy and he is us. I give you an example. A very close associate of mine is a noted expert on gifted children. Mostly gifted children who fail in school. And when she began to write papers about gifted children who fail in school and sent them to the appropriate journal, they all came back rejected without having been read by any referees. And when my associate asked why that is the case, the answer was that I, the editor, have determined that if children are gifted, by definition, they cannot fail in school, and we're not going to publish that stuff. I think we met the enemy. Well, my associate didn't suffer long. She went on to write a couple of really good books about this stuff, became kind of famous for it. But nevertheless, it is true, I think with pain, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. It's in our own homes, on these campuses, it's in our general assemblies, it's in our business communities. There is a great variety in the forms of authoritarianism that will intrude into our best efforts to maintain the status of freedom of speech and inquiry and reflection on our campuses. Beware the authoritarians, but it's not just individual authoritarians we need to watch for. There are other sources of intrusion into these liberties. Sometimes they come from religions. Sometimes they come from the corporate world. Wherever they may come, vigilance is required. Let there be no mistake. When the President of the United States says that he wants to be the great supporter of free speech, nobody here can not welcome that. But one can only suspect that behind it is a concern that speech from the political right is not being heard and not being encouraged on the campuses. I hate to say this in public, but he may have a point. How well do we encourage diversity of view in our own institutions? Time for a little soul searching, I think.
Okay. So now we'll come to the point where we'll go through a couple of these cases, and I'll describe them and get responses from our panelists. Both of them are currently ongoing. First one's about Wake Forest University in North Carolina. They have promised to investigate an anonymous Instagram post from a couple weeks ago. The post appears to be a parody of a student government campaign ad. Why are they investigating it? Because the post says the hypothetical candidate, who's a real student but isn't running for office and didn't even know about the post, wants to build a wall between Wake Forest and Winston-Salem State University. On social media, the prevailing narrative is that the post is racist because Winston-Salem State is an historically black institution. The day after the news of the post came out on social media, Wake Forest President Nathan O. Hatch tweeted a reaction, writing that while he recognized, quote, the intent of the authors may have been a parody of a national issue, the post was, again, quote, deeply offensive and unacceptable. He also thanked the students who called the post out to our attention through the bias reporting system. Now, Wake Forest is a private institution and thus not legally bound by the First Amendment the same way public institutions are, but it does make several guarantees of freedom of expressions to its students. Investigating them for making miscalculated parodies on the internet undermines those guarantees, diminishes the value of Wake Forest's promises, and squanders administrative resources in order to dispatch or to placate a digital mob. Everyone seems to agree that the Instagram post was purely satirical speech rather than conduct, but so far no one has found anything like a cache of bricks or cement or any sort of hastily scrawled blueprint showing stacked bricks on top of each other with smiling students on one side and frowning students on the other. Should the investigation be taken further? Should the university investigate any further? How would you handle it?
Me?
Yeah.
You know, the inherent intention here is, as I think Susan said this too, is somehow to find a way to do two things that sometimes don't fit. And one is to maintain an open, free, unfettered inquiry system that requires freedom of speech, with nothing literally to stop it on the one hand, And on the other hand, trying to find some way to make the learning environment itself welcoming and inclusive to everybody. And sometimes you can't. And it's the conundrum of administration, and I feel very sorry for this president, to be very candid. It happens often enough. But it seems to me that ultimately you have to come down firmly on the side of the defense of expression, even if you find it offensive and vulgar. You can censure it without censoring it. And I think that's the description of it that has to be made here. So the president's caught. Years ago, Jim Friedman, you remember he was president of Dartmouth College, before that University of Iowa. There is, I guess still, an off-campus newspaper there. The Dartmouth Review, I think it's called. It was off-campus, very far right. Ran a banner headline one day, and in the banner they had a quote from Mein Kampf, and there was all kinds of other anti-Semitic charges against them, and one thing or another. And Friedman, who was the president, was also Jewish, confronts a father who comes flying in from Colorado because his daughter is now so offended by this off-campus newspaper, by the way, that she claims she cannot study because the environment is now so hostile to her that she can't do that. And the father confronts President Friedman, and Friedman says, the father is essentially saying, what are you going to do about that newspaper? And he said, there's nothing I really can or want to do about that newspaper. But if we are doing our job well here at Dartmouth, then we are providing your daughter with all of the equipment, all of the necessary intellectual equipment to deal with that sort of thing with more speech. And her ability to write about it should be a great asset to her for the rest of her life. In other words, we're giving her the tools to defend her own liberty. And of course, that went over very, very well, and the father left unhappy, but he left his daughter in school there. That's this issue. How do you balance these things? What's your purpose as an institution? My purpose here at Kent State is to give my students the wherewithal to confront those kinds of things and deal with them because they had the information, the ability to use it in defense of their own liberty. And that was one of the most important reasons for their being and for our being. That's the way I deal with it.
President Berkman?
So I'm with Lady Gaga, who I heard last week describe social media as the toilet bowl of the internet. And Instagram is right at the center of the bowl. But it represents, it represents an increasingly important mode of communication, particularly for young people. And there is going to be increasing amounts of inflammatory information that's going to flow over the channels of social media. Largely, or not largely, but one of the factors, as I mentioned, is because most individuals, or lots of individuals who use social media, particularly those who use it for political purposes, right, are through social media getting one reinforced, consistent channel of information. I mean, one of the raps on, quote, Facebook news, right, and we know this happens throughout social media, that Facebook was simply mining where students went to get news and was providing them with ammunition and reinforcements. And that's what I was talking about the tribalization of information. And this is a new dimension and raises new issues about the First Amendment. And you know, in a different world in which speech is unfettered in many respects, okay? In terms of the particular case, I think as President Schwartz alluded, the president not only has a right, but I think has an obligation to reflect, okay, on moments where he believes that speech or where he believes that messages, okay, are detrimental. Our messages are offensive. He used the word deeply offensive and unacceptable. I'm not quite sure what he meant by unacceptable, all right? That would mean that someone's need to accept them or not accept them. But nonetheless, I mean, that is the president's, I think, right and obligation. Is the president in a position to censor individuals who engage, whether in parody or whether in reality, whether with whatever motive whatever the motives may have been? Are we in a position, as an institution, in a position to censor that kind of speech? I don't believe that they are. So I think that, again, for the president or for the administration and for the campus as a whole, I mean, that's what you ideally would like to see, is these messages, when they become public, when they become, you know, when they become known, you would like to see other voices speak to these messages, not to suppress the message, but to provide a counterpoint to the message, to talk about what the meaning of the message is. So that, I think, is really what has to be encouraged. Now, the question that, the other issue that I maybe will discuss a little bit is, how do we talk about equipping our students with these skills to be able to debate, to be able to reason, to be able to respect and have respectable civic discourse, but how is we as universities really giving students those skills? Where are they coming from, okay? Have we as a university recognized that there are now new instruments, new technologies, new modalities, new practices, basically, that are very much at the center of this equation of the skills that students need to have?
Before Professor Becker, I get your response, I'm also going to invite Dean Rowland, when you have an opportunity or would like to, please chime in. But Professor Becker, you're next.
Professor Becker?
Thank you so much. You know, scenarios like this, when I start reading them, it's like peeling back layers of an onion, right? There are so many layers to the scenario, and it's real world. It's not like an exam I made up to give my students a hard time. This is a real world scenario. So what are the layers? Well, it's at a private function. It was people talking among themselves, right? And then there was sort of a whistleblower involved, who, as I understand it, who made it public. It was also a parody, intended as a parody, which has a special, there are special levels of protection for parody in the law. It's political speech on one level. It's, you know, about building the wall and that kind of thing. But then it takes a really dark turn. If we were just at that point. Oh.
Mr. Dover was knocked over by your comments.
I know.
Yeah. Floored by your comments.
It was intended as a parody, I believe. Yeah. Isn't that the way?
Yes.
That
Mm-hmm.
Right. In prison, the hypothetical, the speech that was being criticized, that was being called out, was intended as a parody.
Correct.
I know an awful lot of parodies are usually not very clever, and you don't even quite understand them, but it does have in the law a special area of protection, and I don't want to get off into the law, but then the building the walls political speech between universities. And if it had ended there, if it was just a rival university, like us in Case or something, I don't think people would have made much of it. But it's between one university and a historically black university, black college, so now we've introduced racism. And in our society, as I mentioned earlier, when you introduce racism, things are going to blow up, and they should. I mean, we should be discussing it, we should be dealing with it. The problem is, when we start looking at it then through the lens of we have to stop this kind of speech and we have to punish the speaker, now we've missed all of our opportunities. We don't have a teaching moment anymore. We have a speaker who is now a martyr for the case, and again, for the cause. And I'm not claiming the speaker was a white supremacist. I don't know, and I don't think we have, but we've taken the whole focus away from the issue of racism, which we need to really be discussing, especially on college campuses, and trying to find some common ground and some changes there. Now we've got a martyr, and we've changed the whole conversation from one that's really critically important about racism to about censorship. Censorship has now become the star of this and taken all our energy away. It sucked all the energy, all the air out of the room. So it's really unfortunate. I'm not saying the university should just pretend like this never happened. It's on your desk. You gentlemen certainly have to deal with this. It shows up on your desk. You have to deal with it. So the university comes out, makes really strong statements, provides other forums to discuss the underlying issue that's really problematic here, maybe establishes some more bridges with the other university. I don't know what their relationship was like, to show what teamwork looks like, as opposed to just allowing this to be, again, to have a martyr and make it all about censorship and not about what the real issue is here.
Well, I'm sitting here thinking about some of what Ron Berkman has said about preparing our students, and as the dean of a college, that's uppermost on my mind. And the parity for me is somewhat immaterial. The question is, how are we preparing our students to be clarions of, I would say, a bulwark against this sort of behavior or thought? Are we doing a good job of preparing our students right from the beginning? What would that mean? How would that manifest? I think of North Carolina and the statue that stood for more than 100 years, Silent Sam, and it was taken down by students saying it was racist. And yeah, it was probably a racist statue from racist moorings, but how could we have educated those students that taking down a statue is not the end of racism, but the opening for a dialogue? What can higher education do to promote such a dialogue? I think we're falling down there. And I don't know what to do about it, but I think that's where we start. We don't start with university presidents censoring. We start with, how do we educate our students to act and deliberate in a free society?
Okay, here's another one, and then we'll quit and open it up. In February of this year, anti-police tweets and comments by University of California, Davis professor Joshua Clover from 2014 to 2016 surfaced. Among other comments, Clover had written, "I'm thankful that every living cop will one day be dead, some by their own hands, some by others, too many of old age." While UC Davis Chief Marketing and Communications Officer Dana Tupasis stated that, quote, "Public statements like those made by Professor Clover are accorded a high level of protection under the First Amendment." A March 5th ABC 10 article reported that the university was investigating Clover's statements. California Assemblyman James Gallagher has been pressuring UC Davis to fire Clover. Gallagher promoted Clover's termination and, after getting 10,000 signatures, handed out copies of the petition to UC Davis students in front of May's office. UC Davis has said they will not be investigating Clover. Should they be? How would you handle it? Let me start with Professor Becker. Excuse me.
If you wouldn't mind, I would like to hand off to our two presidents again who've had to deal with this issue directly, because my approach is more theoretical, and I really appreciate their perspective as boots on the ground. I'm happy to respond to that.
I yield to the gentleman on the right.
Yeah, right. And I'm going to yield back the balance of my time. I have never had to deal with anything like it, I must say. And even though I've had advance notice about this, I am somewhat baffled by it. It seems, I wouldn't investigate it either. I don't think I'd accord it that kind of dignity. He may have a right to say that, and probably does. But what are you supposed to do once you heard something that is that far off the wall? I guess, frankly, even though I've had advanced knowledge, I'd want to sit with some counselors about this, some of my colleagues, and talk about this. No doubt we're going to get some muscle up from the legislature, right? From the press, from students, not to mention the police departments. Good God. I want to sit with those people too and think this through. But I'd rather hear professors take on it theoretically. I'm not even sure how I could cope with it theoretically. I don't know how. I'd probably be over in a law school.
So, I mean, the issue we always have, right? I mean, in this particular case, okay, to me, I believe this is protected communication. Whether the individual is a faculty member, whether the individual is a staff member, whether the individual is a student, okay? Is it toxic? Is it derogatory information? To be sure. The problem with these calls, with these judgments, is that we're dealing with law and not science. And actually, we're dealing with theology and not even law, okay? Really, what constitutes shouting fire in a crowded theater? What meets that test in terms of speech, okay? Where is the line crossed? And each time it happens, it's going to be largely an interpretive judgment. You could look at case law, and you could look at previous instances of it, okay? But each one of these cases is, in many ways, unique. They're all similar, but they're all, in some ways, unique. So the difficulty for me, okay, in terms of what an administrative response would be, is to try to understand, and I think Mike is right, it has to be understood through a consultative process, okay, about where speech does cross this line. And where speech does cross this line and impacts the ability of students to be able to be in the kind of environment we've all championed here, an environment of inclusiveness, of openness, of exchange, et cetera, okay? Where it does cross that line, okay, I think it does warrant action on the part of the university.
But finding that line.
But finding that line is, as I say, not even law, it's theology. But we have a law professor, so.
Well, yeah, and I would say that 99 out of 100 courts would not find these to be fighting words or any kind of words that would be actionable under any criminal statute.
Again, why is my experience always in that 100th court?
I don't know, but I mean, when there's a call for an investigation, I'm not quite sure what that means.
Yeah.
Does that mean that now we go and get all his social media accounts and start stripping and see if we can compile a case against him? What did he even mean by these comments? I mean, clearly he's upset by police I'm reading into it through my own lens, right, which we all do in these things. What I'm reading is that he has either been a victim or someone he knows, or he's just fed up with cases of police misconduct, and there have been a lot of them, and that's not being derogatory to the police who show up and put their life on the line every day and do a good job. I've been on both sides of that, I have to say. I've had well, I'm just going to leave that aside. But the point is, what is this investigation going to do? Is it a witch hunt? Because it certainly feels like that. Yeah. It looks like the university is going to look for more information that we can use. And maybe he's made some things that are racist comments, and then maybe he's made some anti-Semitic, and we can pretty much build a whole new picture of this individual, which may be completely false, which is done on his own private time with his own private belief, and not disseminated in the university community, and we can make this guy, we can absolutely demonize him. Or maybe this was just an offhand comment, and really, does the university want to spend, or should it spend, its resources investigating people, conducting witch hunts to find out, where we're going to place this person on the scale from a good person that's deserving of a university position versus someone who should not be let anywhere near students because they're a bad role model? Should the university be doing that? And I would say no. And I do think this is a state university, so there certainly are First Amendment rights here, and I think this person was within their First Amendment rights to make these comments.
That's why I thought I just set it aside.
Yeah.
I get to be moderator, so I don't have to answer the question. But I will say, though, that going back to my previous statement, how can we build a culture in our higher education universities that process this and it doesn't become or escalate into something that we have to make a decision about one person? What can we put in place from the very beginning to emphasize deliberative discussion of free speech?
I think one thing that really helps is having a policy, and I'll tell you, I read through almost all the university policies on free speech, and I can't say, as with my ACLU hat on, that they're all perfect, but I was impressed by the volume and the thoughtfulness in them. And the thing that seems to me with the university, what you have to really think about is, when the speech comes out and it's offensive to people, the first thing has to be a strong statement that agreeing that it's offensive and it's inappropriate. But that doesn't equate then with, again, demonizing the person or sanctioning the person or going into this investigation where you're turning their life inside out. I will bet, I will bet that there are people in this room, that no one in this room could go under that kind of spotlight, that we could have every email we've ever written, every tweet, every Facebook post, either on its face or how other people might interpret it, that we would all pass that test without having offended someone seriously. And I'm serious about that. I'm amazed. I will say I'm shocked sometimes with what I see on Facebook from people I know well. And I think, well, they don't really hold this position. They say something, I think, that sounds really kind of racist. And I know the person really well, and I would never equate, I wouldn't label them anyway, but I would never think that would come from them. And then you talk to them about it, and they're like, oh, no, that's just a joke I heard, or I meant something totally different. So if we're going to go under the scrutiny every time, one thing comes up, and to have other people calling for their job immediately, that this person has to just be sacked now, and that's just really extreme. And you're going to be doing this all the time then. Whoever's in administration, you're going to have a special department, and it's going to feel a lot like, I think, McCarthyism, where we're going to start, investigating everyone to see what the real intent of their tweet was, and is this a pattern, and does this harm the university? And I could see it going down into a very, very dark place for all of us, and certainly for free speech.
Very
So I think to elaborate or to respond to what Dean Anglin said about how we impart these skills, how we equip students to have these skills. And I think in many respects, it has to start with the faculty. Okay, faculty have to be able to model that behavior in their classrooms. Okay, that is, they have to encourage, and it can be woven into. It's not one subject matter. It's not just talking about it in sociology or economics or political science or urban affairs or law. It can be woven into lots of disciplines and lots of discourse. And it is about trying to encourage students to think critically. Now, we all talk about how well we've done, okay, in terms of imparting critical thinking in students, and we have. And I truly believe that students who have a university education have a better toolkit, but they don't have the necessary toolkit. Because when you look at the data, unfortunately, in terms of the degree that which you can measure critical skills for students, okay, from the time they come out of high school to the time they leave the university, they don't measurably increase.
No, they don't change.
They don't measurably increase at all, okay? So the notion that we're modeling this behavior that we're talking about teaching and equipping these students with these skills, we're modeling it through critical thinking in the classroom, just does not hold up.
I wonder if I can follow up, Professor Bowen. Have we lost something in the American higher education complex in the move towards getting our students a job? That we've lost our way in terms of educating our students to be citizens?
Oh, you have touched a nerve. I want all the scripts back where I've worked on the same question. If you ask yourself, what do people want when they come here? You ask them point blank, and 99 out of 100 times you're going to hear about get a job, a better job. I'm telling you, I think that's okay.
Yep.
I wanted my kids, in the worst way, I wanted my kids the hell off of my payroll and onto somebody else's. And it worked. And that's good. But I wanted some other things for them too. And I wanted them to become people who knew how to learn in many different ways, who can inquire into the world as political scientists, as people in the arts, people who understood literature and language. I wanted them to understand that those were all ways of knowing their world. I wanted that for them. You know what else I wanted for them? I wanted them to understand that there is life after work, that there is room in their lives for art and sport and all kinds of things that are important to them. They should learn about those things. But the fourth thing I wanted, I was always thinking about this. I wanted my kids and every other student that came to the university to walk away from here better able to defend his or her own liberty when they left than they could do it before they came. And there's no evidence that that happened. And that's a failure. The other three things, I think that works. That doesn't, as far as I can tell. At least I don't see any evidence of it.
So Professor Bowen, the chair of the Faculty Senate, is here, and I wonder what his thoughts are in terms of the role of faculty, okay, in beginning to engage more deeply in civic education.
A punt. I want to see
you can tweet about it if you like.
I want to see some sort of a systematic forum created for positive responses to conflicting ideas. I think we need to be able to teach or to accept that people have different and conflicting ideas, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. And to be able to talk about them. Whether that happens in the classroom is kind of, that doesn't happen in a statistics class, right? It might happen in an English class. There's places where it could happen, I suppose, and other places where it couldn't.
So I wonder, or the students who are here, do students feel encumbered in classrooms to articulate points of view that they may feel are out of sync with what they perceive to be the faculty member's prevailing point of view? I mean, if the faculty member says, I like blue, okay, obviously, you know, and I think blue is the best color in the rainbow, right? Are students comfortable getting up saying, I don't like blue, I don't think it's the best color, I like red, and here's how I like red? Do we create environments in classrooms where students have the freedom, okay, to do that? I mean, I know when I was teaching, I mean, I struggled with it, that there were students who didn't want to ask questions because they felt, you know, it wasn't a good question, it wasn't the right question, it might not be, you know, consistent with what the message in the classroom was to be. And you struggle. I struggled as a faculty member, okay, to try to impart to students that there is no, the only bad question is the question that's never asked, okay? That's the only really bad question. And that, you know, that we have to be able to, this is a safe environment. That's what universities should create in that classroom, you know, a feeling of safety for students.
Should be safe.
Because there's not a lot of other places where they feel safe, right? So if we can create a feeling of safety for students, that they have the freedom to articulate it, right? I think that begins to provide the skill set we're talking about.
So, you know, I'm an employee, but I'm also a student. If students are not speaking up, I will.
Good.
You know, I'm an adult, so I never felt encumbered. I don't feel encumbered. But I look around classrooms, and I think students do feel
I think they do.
You do.
I don't think that a lot of the professors here really have the requisite conflict management skills to have that happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that might be something you want to consider being deliberate about in terms of creating environments where students can challenge. Because you're not just talking about asking questions. You're talking about actually challenging. the
Absolutely.
answers,
Right.
And having that go over well and having students not be penalized for that. And I don't see that happening. Not very often.
Yes. Here.
I wasn't going to answer it first because I graduated in the fall. So but yeah, I actually totally think that there isn't an encumbrance.
There is not?
There is not.
Uh-huh.
I have some very, I think, practical political ideas. And I've been in classrooms with people who are maybe a little closer to me on the political spectrum and professors that aren't, right? That might be on the totally opposite end. And I have never, ever, once in my time here, been told, can't say that, or been worried about the kind of reaction that people have given. I mean, if you have a political belief that you care about, you know, it's not just something you throw out there because you want brownie points for the social media crowd. You actually care about in your heart. You are willing to kind of maybe be the prize. I will say that I haven't felt like that because I think one of the things that, you know, was given to me here was the ability to argue and, you know, articulate my feelings pretty well. I think I've done a pretty good job of doing that. So I have some more comments on that, but I'll say.
Yeah, Jody. The CSU hair girl.
I think it depends a lot on the professor and more so the students themselves. Me personally, I've never had an issue questioning anything, you know, starting a discussion. But I know that there are a lot of students, especially those that maybe struggle with social anxiety or other issues, or don't feel comfortable speaking up like that. And I feel like in those cases, generally speaking, the faculty does not do a great job of trying to draw them into the conversation. And in addition, I have had, they're rare, but I've had some professors that are actively derogatory to our questions.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
Hey,
That's not good to hear.
Can I ask, just for a second, have you found some students in your classes precede anything they say with, this may seem like a dumb question, but? I always took that as a signal of fear.
Second, I'll get these one at a time here. There's one over here next, and then over here. Okay.
No, what about point?
I kind of agree with what you guys were saying. I think it also, like she said, it depends on the professor, but I think it also depends on the class subject. Like, I've heard some people say that certain, even just colleges or subjects are more for either like more right-leaning professors and students or left-leaning professors and students. And then
combativeness on the part of the faculty member or the student?
On the, more so on the student, you know, I don't know how to explain it better than that, but I think like, for example, I think there's an issue with the faculty themselves, of them having their opinion, but also of them overseeing the other students in the classroom, not gang up on another student that hasn't given such an opinion. Even if it's backed by facts, you know, people will just get emotional, and that's okay, but that should be a teaching moment for everyone in the classroom, not only the students and the professor, to figure out, okay, how do we make this a solution instead of an emotional fight?
I say, there was a hand up over here. Yeah.
I think it's kind of interesting when we talk about like the students challenging professors and asking questions and stuff, because we're sort of only focusing on like the university context. But I think that the problem that most students have comes from primary education, and also like this idea of like students basically going to school to get jobs, is that schools are factory lines that are designed to teach kids one way to think and only one way to think, and they're not really concerned with challenging teachers. They're only concerned with studying things so they can get a degree so they can go and get a job. But I don't know, it's kind of interesting to me to think, because like my mom grew up in the Soviet Union, and like not too long ago I had a conversation with her and my stepdad. And my stepdad said something like, the reason why American education is so good compared to like the Soviet education is because we teach kids to like be like free thinkers and like challenge things. And as somebody who is almost done with their education, I say that is absolutely wrong. And then we produce some of these stupidest people. But it's also ironic because the Soviet education system was significantly better than ours, which is why they were able to advance so quickly. Not that I'm advocating for the Soviet model. It's just very ironic, is that we have this idea that we're like so free thinking. It's completely not the case. And I don't think that it starts at a university level. The answer is at a university level. It's a system level. It goes all the way back to like kindergarten or even preschool.
One of the most terrifying moments I've had as a professor here was a student that said in my office one day, "Professor Bowen, your problem is you make me think." And she said, I don't need to think. I want to be a judge. Just tell me what I need to do. Yeah, yes. Yes.
There's something I sort of wanted to say, which is this wonderful presentation has done there are a lot of wonderful insights about those things on a campus where it's an open forum, where in a sense we do not police the content. Someone's standing out in the courtyard, handing out leaflets, making brilliant points, making stupid points, making whatever they can say. It protects someone who is putting forward a wonderful, sophisticated idea. It puts someone who's putting forth some sort of vile, utterly unfounded garbage. However, the relationship between, that really we haven't talked about as much, is those things in a university where it's not utterly open, where the very thing we're doing is imposing certain kinds of standards, discipline, in other words, which are also part of those things that lead toward truth, which is where, for example, as a faculty member, I do not have the right to be incompetent, for example. If when I came up for tenure, I did not have a First Amendment right to do work that the experts might feel false crap. Where in a sense there are certain standards that are not merely where we let everyone express their opinions and hope in dialogue that the better thing comes out, which I happen to generally believe in, but where in a sense we are imposing some kinds of things where we in effect do evaluate, judge, privilege particular viewpoints. And President Schwartz, there was something you said that got a little close to when you were talking about the journal, where the editor of the journal had rejected an article on what clearly in context you were presenting as an utterly unjustified, and I assume unjustified in disciplinary standards, a prior assumption that this can't be right. Now, surely, okay, you may have been right in that instance, but surely the response that we ought to have to what that editor did is either A, that editor is making a really stupid decision that is nonetheless protected by that person's authority as having achieved the end, or the extreme view, which is where you really want to declare the guy incompetent. And the problem I have is, unless you're going to go to the extreme view of saying anyone who said where that becomes part of a case of incompetence. Other than that, you kind of things that we have where in academic world we evaluate ideas and choose ideas, and that's a healthy thing. No, the good journal will not accept it. And so I guess, I mean, is there a little bit, because there's one kind of function of speech in university we talked about, and the other one, which is the one maybe more in the classroom and in journals, where, in a sense, there is such a thing as things where, you know, no, you're not going to get an A for that paper where you argue your own popular Shakespeare's books, or should you? I mean, it's sort of like being flat earth.
Professor Schwartz. President Schwartz.
Either way.
Yeah, whoever wants to answer, answer.
Yeah, I think my point was to see that as an idea suppression notion. This was a new idea, and rather than say, I'm going to send this out to referees and let them have a look, he fired it right back on open. I think that's not competent. It's not competent editorship. That's my opinion. And I'm very sensitive about this because that person was my wife. And she has this crazy reputation of being the person who started this whole business of exceptional people, intellectually exceptional people who fail in institutional settings like this.
Professor Gallagher.
So I had a guest speaker last night, and he's an endowed chair at John Carroll, Robert Giacomo, and he studies ethics. And he spoke about toxic environments and derogatory behaviors and abusive supervision in a corporate setting. And he described all the terrible outcomes, which I've studied this, stress outcomes and the literal biology changes when you're under stress. And I started to think about, if we look at this as an organization, I know we need to allow forums, but what do we do to combat that? Because he literally spoke about diversity, and that, when you have constant things coming at you that feel derogatory, and perception is reality, those things start to chip away at your health and well-being. And so I do worry about that. And how do we fix that for our students with allowing also the diversity of thought?
So I think one of the interesting things that's happened in this discussion is that we have 5 academics who essentially agree. Okay,
Which is a scary thing.
Which is a really scary thing to begin with. But what do they agree on? I think that we agree, and anyone can take umbrage or dissent, that we are at a very important moment, okay, historically and politically. This is not business as usual, all right? That this is an inflection point in terms of where society is going. And what do we, as institutions, what responsibility do we, as institutions, have to take at this moment, okay, in which the skills that we are prepared to impart, all right, are not being imparted and are not being utilized.
Yes, sir.
I actually came with some questions prepared, and one of them is actually directly related to this. And I can be a bit verbose, but I think that in this case, like, what I have to say is a bit complex, so may I speak?
Yes, go ahead. Direct your question to somebody.
Okay, well, I would like to hear from each of the panelists on this particular issue. So I want to start by saying that in the past few years as a student at Cleveland State, I felt encouraged to explore ideas and speak my mind more than in any other institution I've been part of.
Not everybody hears you.
Hello. And so, yeah, for the past few years here in Cleveland State, I felt encouraged to explore ideas and speak my mind more than in any other institution I've been part of. And from what I've heard, this is a common experience among many others in the LGBT community, which I'm part of, who in many cases could not voice their experiences as LGBT people until coming to this university. It might not be obvious to straight or cisgender people, but being free to be ourselves is often a prerequisite to freely expressing and exploring academic, professional, and artistic ideas of all kinds, not just those related to our gender and sexuality. Because speech attracts attention, and minorities who do not feel welcomed as they are often don't participate as much in class, do not approach their professors for help, and avoid extracurricular participation. And I think this is probably true for most minorities. So I also want to make it clear that a big reason that I and many other LGBT students experience this freedom is because of Cleveland State's explicit policies against discrimination and harassment, and the positive programming offered to us, such as the LGBT Student Services Center, and the many faculty members who have taken it upon themselves to undergo safe space training. So without these explicit protections, there would be much less reason for us to feel free to speak our minds on campus. And yet, I've heard over and over from other students, from community members, and even faculty members, that the same things that ensure my freedom are restricting other people's freedom, particularly their freedom to tell me and people like me that our way of life is delusional, dangerous, perverse, or even that we deserve to die. And I'm curious to know whether each of the panelists here believe that, and if so, how you would justify that position.
Believe what? I'm lost.
That explicitly protecting minorities and providing services for them is also restricting other people's free speech.
Oh, wow.
Well, I for me, that you feel what the feelings you just expressed are a moment of pride for the university, for people to be able to feel comfortable in this environment, to be who they are, okay, is something that I think we all, as university administrators, would strive to create, okay? Is that going to create, another dimension, our individuals, okay? Because we have sought to create that environment. And what we talked about here, are going to be other individuals, okay, who are going to make destructive comments, okay, attack the principles, attack the individuals, attack the orientation, etc. They're going to be, okay? And can we shut them off, or should we shut them off? The answer is, I don't think the answer, to me, the answer is no, okay? But if the community is, as you say, one in which your comfort level is high, and you have a feeling of solidarity with the community inside this university, right? And you're able to articulate, as you have, those feelings, to me, that's the best armor, that's the best defense.
But I will also say, your colleagues who define abridgment of your rights as an abridgment of their free speech, they need to be educated about free speech. And that's the nub of the issue here. If we're not doing a good job of defining what free speech is, then I think we're falling down, not only as an institution, but as a society.
It's a really interesting question. By the way, I'm a member of the LGBT community. I've been out for a very long time, and it wasn't always easy, I'll say, at this university. I worked on the Safe Space program when we started it many, many years ago. But it's also been really great. I mean, the thing is, if the university is truly committed to diversity, and I absolutely believe this university is, then there are certain values that we all hold dear, that regardless of sexual orientation or race or disability or gender or any other very long list, that everyone should be treated fairly. And I think, when other people say, I hear this a lot, people say, well, you're infringing on my rights because I no longer have the right to hate you or speak against you, whatever. My view is constitutional rights aren't like pie. It's not like if I get a piece, there's none left for you. There's enough to go all around. So if you're not comfortable in an inclusive environment, and that's a core value, then that's an issue that maybe people need to re-examine whether this is where they need to be. But it doesn't mean people are silencing them. It means that the values of this organization, we all seek out organizations and places where we're comfortable, right? Where our ideals and our values and our commitments and our work all align. That's why I work so closely with the ACLU. If they're not comfortable in that environment, that's unfortunate. But it is the environment that it is. And the alternative is that the university is always going to be trying, like windshield wiper blades, going back and forth and saying, okay, we support your right to be exclusionary and hateful and you know, target certain groups of people, but yet we welcome everybody. Those two things can't exist in the same world. So I'm very proud of this university for the inclusivity. I know we just changed a couple of years ago to include gender identity. In the class of protections. So I'm just not apologetic, I guess, and I don't think the university should be apologetic that it's inclusive and it welcomes diversity in lots of different forms. And we're not taking away other people's rights. They can still voice their rights. They can still do letters to the editor. They can still do a class paper. I had students, I taught sexual orientation in the law for a number of years. I created the course, I did all my own materials, and it was a controversial course when it started, and I always said my goal was one day to teach this as a history course, when just, you know, everybody's equal and this is just history. That never happened, but my point is, it was a difficult course sometimes, and I would really encourage conservative students to come into the course, and sometimes they did, and I had standards about we're all going to respect each other, and if I noticed people were shutting down and not participating, I reached out to them privately and had conversations with them. So there's a lot the university can do. I don't mean to suggest that people have to just get with the program or go home. I don't mean that. But as an educational institution, we can build a lot of bridges between students, between faculty and students, and get people at least respecting each other. But the idea that, you know, they can't exercise their rights because we're recognizing someone else's, I think it's another one of those false dichotomies.
That's right.
Okay, I've got you, but let me give.
No.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I just kind of wanted to go off of previous questions with the influence of stress.
I'm sorry, I can't
Here,
hear.
here, can you come up and people, if you want to make it so everybody can hear it. Thank you.
I mean, it's kind of just a continuation of the previous two questions as far as the influence of stress on the body and your capacity to learn and be a good student and developed intellectually, and also the influence of that type of harassment or negative speech that should be. Basically, I wanted to ask the question of where do you draw the line between something that is, you know, I don't agree with your opinion and maybe we should reach out and try to build those bridges, but I'm not going to censor you. I heard somebody on the stage said before that, like, there's a difference between censorship and censorship. And where do you decide when something is actually deserved of censorship? I don't want to, you know, rake up the mud, but I am called to mind of the case last year with the transphobic posters that went up that called for their increased rates of suicide and whatnot, which could be argued was almost, you know, a direct, like, request or threat, I suppose, even though if there wasn't anything explicit, you know, threat to their lives or anything. It's like, is something like that deserve to be censored as opposed to just censured?
So,
I'm sorry.
no, for me, last year's issue was, for me, the most difficult issue that I faced in 9 years here at the university. And a lot of it had to do with this issue of what kind of environment do we want to have, all right, and what do we want to build. And we had a town hall meeting, which was an incredibly painful town hall meeting with 400 or 500 students. I don't know if you were there, any of you were there, okay. And it was, you know, it was a passionate discussion. It was a difficult discussion, okay. It is difficult to articulate that while I do not in any way, shape, or form agree with the content of this message or the implication of this message, When I've talked with people who know this law, they say it does not cross the line, okay? To be able to say that, as the example we gave where the president said, you know, about the Wake Forest issue, that, you know, I don't agree, I find it offensive and unacceptable. I find it offensive and unacceptable, right? But I don't find it acceptable to either repress, okay, or, you know, limit the ability, if you're talking about, of individuals, okay, to take that. Now, is there a point where it might cross the line? There is a point where it might cross the line. I mean, you know, the Milo Yiannopoulos, the Spencers, okay, who come to campus explicitly, okay, explicitly to generate discord and violence, all right, on campus. To me, that definitely crosses the line, okay? So it wasn't, but I think as a, and I think you both alluded to this, as a exercise in that town hall, as a free speech exercise in that town hall, I think we grew as an institution. I think we recognized some things. I think we made some changes in policy. I think we understood, okay, more about the importance of safe space, the importance of having support systems, okay, for these individuals. But we did it in a forum that was painful. But a forum, okay, and believe me, nobody in that forum, okay, seemed ashamed about articulating their point of view.
Can I make a couple quick points about just about censorship generally? So, you know, a lot of the European nations have laws that are, you know, anti-hate speech, that say you can't direct comments that demean or stigmatize, you know, certain classes of people and that kind of thing. Do we look at Europe as it is today and think this is a utopia where everyone's getting along well? I mean, censorship and trying to regulate, the law can never regulate human behavior or human act. We can punish certain things. We can say the line is we can punish it. It's not going to change people. It's not going to change how societies work on issues like that. The thing about censorship is it's very hard to figure out what language are we going to use about who is subject to it and what is inappropriate conduct. At the end of the day, there's going to be a human being who's going to have a lot of discretion to decide. We could have, it could look like the best law, the best regulations, the best procedure for going through this. At the end of the day, there's going to be a human being deciding. And they're going to decide based on their own values to a certain extent. So just think about it. We come up with this great regulatory system with great definitions of what's appropriate to say and what isn't in a given environment. Think about how that law would be interpreted and applied if it was at a federal level under an Obama administration versus under a Trump administration. It's the same law, it's the same regulations. At the end of the day, you're going to have radically different results as to who is censored and who is allowed to speak. And that's my biggest fear with any kind of censorship, is who decides. Who gets to decide what's appropriate, and is it, even if you've got a legal structure?
Okay, we got time for one more question, and okay, I'm going to, no, I was going to ask the lady with the Dartmouth hat on. Yes.
There's this conversation about how the university values inclusion, and I can tell you, for me, if you are valuing inclusion, having the KKK come to speak and to try to have some civil discourse about the fact that I don't have a right to exist is problematic. It says to me, you don't value inclusion, you certainly aren't valuing me. So I get that, you know, we need to be able to be uncomfortable and have discourse and have different ideas. But at some point, you do have to draw the line. And the truth is, more than likely, the person who's drawing that line is going to look more like you than me. Mm-hmm. And so then what does that mean in terms of the lens that you're using to determine what's appropriate and what isn't? So when you read those two case studies, the second case study really shocked you. The first one wasn't so bad. And that might have something to do with, you know, your lens. My lens might have been different. So you're right, it does depend on who's making the decision. And I think that's part of the problem with the whole thing.
Anybody?
So just, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but if we reverse the coin, hypothetically, okay, what would you feel about a Anglo individual objecting to the Nation of Islam coming here, okay? You would feel the same way? Mm-hmm.
I think the question, as you framed it, is the burning issue right now in free speech. And I'm saying even the ACLU is wrestling with it. you know, our view, and it's a little bit of a platitude, but has always been, you know, the cure for bad speech is more speech. And I believe that in my heart, but when the rubber meets the road, when we're dealing with Charlottesville, for example, in situations like that, the dynamics change, and the organization itself, the ACLU, has done a lot of soul searching, all kinds of, you know, additional equity and inclusion training, doing lots of things. At the end of the day, we haven't come up with a really great answer for it yet, because when the rubber meets the road and you're really talking about, okay, we're all for free speech, we're all against censorship, but we're going to bring someone in who's going to deny the very right to exist, not just in the right to exist of certain people, whether they're gay or people of color or people who are Jewish or whatever, and that's where the theory and the reality just part ways. No. No. Right.
How is that possible? That is experienced as violence for me, physical violence. That emotional violence to the body feels like pain. So then when you do that in an institution, students respond.
Okay, well, there's not a quick answer to that one. And I think the issues that we're dealing with here are ones that we'll continue to deal with for a long while. And I hope our discussion today has been useful and productive in terms of moving the conversations on a little bit. I want to thank the panelists for your participation. If you have any last quick comments, please feel free, and then we'll call it a wrap.
I was just reflecting on what must have happened at the ACLU when the decision about Nazis marching in Skokie had to be made. I can only imagine what that was like. And it's still going on. I mean, it's the tough call.
Well, this is a small step, this forum. It's just my hope that we can find some way to magnify this, some way to broaden the audience, some way to engage, okay, students, faculty, and staff around the issue. Because as I say, the one thing that we agreed on up here, right, is that we are at a very important moment.
Tough time.
Professor Becker?
And I just have to go back to my theme about censorship. I do believe, as a general rule, the cure for bad speech is more speech, not less. And I think with censorship, the problem is you're going to give somebody, and it may look more like me, and you're absolutely right, the power to make that decision. And, you know, Nazi Germany had very extensive laws that were supposed to, you know, prohibit hate and that kind of. Nazi Germany had that, and we saw what that produced. So, but the question as you framed it, and I really thank you for doing that, is the cutting edge in all of this, and it's where theory meets reality, and we have to work through it, and I don't have a solution.
Dean Anglin.
Well, you know, the question becomes, why hold a forum like this in a College of Urban Affairs? Well, 60% of the world in the next 10 years, I believe, will be urbanized. We're better to hold a discussion like this about free speech, the density of our human contact, how we're going to adjudicate our fears. So I just want to thank you, Professor Bowen, and the panel for a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And hopefully we can continue it in some other form. I want to thank the audience for coming by and listening and participating. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming.